Hi everyone, welcome to the NOAA Central Library. We're very excited to have you here. We're very excited to have Dr. Kim Marshall here to give her presentation on the U.S. Fisheries disasters, trends, causes, and impacts of Pacific salmon declines on Native American communities. And with that, please take it away.
So thanks for coming, everyone. As she said, I'm Kim Marshall McLean. I recently completed my PhD at George Mason University, and so I'm going to present an overview of my dissertation, which is a very broad dissertation. It's classic environmental science. It's interdisciplinary. So there's a lot of different components to it. So I'll be providing an overview of that whole dissertation today. This research was self-funded and conducted independently without NOAA funding. So it analyzes the publicly available data from NOAA's website on fishery disaster determinations. So this presentation will cover the legal authorities and the costs of disasters. It will also cover the methods and results of the trend analyses that I conducted, the impacts on communities, so there's a lot going to happen today, and a little on recommendations and future research, although there's a lot more of that in my dissertation than I'll have time to cover today, but I'll try to hit some highlights. So firstly, I realize a lot of people might not be familiar with what fishery disasters actually are. So what is a disaster? So I'm going to give some more specific details in a few minutes, but simply put, a fishery disaster is a way that the government can provide funds when a resource fails, and then as a consequence of that, there's a commercial fishery failure. So that involves revenue loss. So there's at least those two components, the disaster first, a resource failure first, then it triggers loss of revenue being analyzed. So when I first started as the fishery disasters lead in 2016, I was told by my disaster predecessors, one of whom is here today, Chris Wright and others, Tara Scott. So the trend so far is that, you do get disasters sometimes in spurts, requests for them, but, you won't get a whole lot, it won't take up a whole lot of your time. But then the requests started coming in as I was the new lead, and I wasn't seeing that play out. So I was seeing that the requests just started coming and coming and coming, and they're still coming. Just got a new one yesterday. And they haven't stopped. There's been a steady flow. So now this isn't what had been described to me. So I looked through the history of requests and found that there seemed to be a steep uptick in the requests from history, through looking at it historically. So that was the policy, Kim, of me, basically just looking at that side of it. But then the ecologist in me kicked in, and I started asking questions like, what is causing these disasters? It looks like they're disproportionately coming from the West Coast, from tribes, and from climate-related causes. So I wondered if that was just a blip in the natural cycle of things, like maybe I was looking at just a few data points in the overall distribution, but I just wanted to find out. And so the full-blown set of trends analyses on NOAA's entire data set was born, and I took leave without pay and ventured off to answer these questions. Oh, I'm going the wrong way, sorry about that. Sorry, my slides aren't advancing. Just a second. So the National Marine Fisheries Service administers the fishery disaster process under two authorities, the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Management and Conservation Act, or the MSA, and the Interjurisdictional Fisheries Act, or what we call the IFA. So there must be a sudden decrease in biomass, a disaster to the resource, like I mentioned, first and foremost, before anything else can be, looked at. And so not all causes are allowable. Overfishing is not allowed because management regimes should be able to address that. So therefore, there needs to be some allowable causes in these categories, which are natural, man-made, or undetermined. So, and that has to be a commercial thing. So there must be money involved. And NIMS had to translate the legal language into policy so that they came up with these different percentage criteria that you see here. So revenue declines from the disaster are relative to the average of the previous the previous 5 years as follows. So there's 6 years of data involved. There's the year of the disaster, and then looking at the previous 5 years to that and averaging those. So if you have a loss of greater than 80%, then it's an obvious failure. Between 35 and 80 means, well, we don't really know. We need to look at some more details and ask a lot more questions. Did you have an opportunity to fish somewhere else? And just a lot of other factors, come into play. And if it's less than 35%, then that's pretty much saying that there's not enough loss, more or less. So disaster assistance is not just compensation. It's meant to prevent future disasters and assist those communities that are affected. So it's important to understand the different types of disasters. There are 2 main categories: the catastrophic regional fishery disasters that's laid out in the MSA. Those are typical disasters, things that you know of, like hurricanes, wide-scale destruction, that sort of thing. These are usually not specific to a fishery because we just know that there's no docks or there's no boats or there's no fish houses because they've been destroyed by the hurricane or whatever. And so then there are also the disasters that affect specific fisheries, which are not always as large of a scale, as dramatic, or as disastrous in quotes in that obvious sense. And they can be regional, where more than one state is impacted, like this Deepwater Horizon oil spill, which affected 5 Gulf states in 2010. So, and to have a disaster, someone has to request one, and that has to be an elected official. So at the moment, there is no standing fund or pot of money that's set aside for disasters. There are no regulations and no set timeline. But that's being looked at right now, and that might change in the next year. So we're watching that. So just to emphasize, you can't have a disaster if you've overfished, and also you have to be able to prove your loss. And in this case, what NMFS wants to see is a loss of 35% or higher compared to that 5-year average. So it's important to note that if you've chosen not to fish in the last 5 years, or if you weren't allowed to fish, then you won't qualify, because it has to be 5 consecutive years of data that you have to be able to show. So because only commercial fisheries are eligible, my data set just analyzed the research. All of the data are commercial data. So, however, when the funds are made available, they can be spent more broadly, like on recreational fisheries and other needs. So just really quickly, this is just how the process generally goes at the moment. Is that a request comes in to the secretary, and i.e. me, because in addition to this research, I'm actually the national disaster lead for NOAA. So it comes to me and my office, to fisheries, and then I work with the headquarters and the region to analyze that request for allowable cause, the resource decline, and a commercial fishery failure. And then we make a recommendation to the secretary to approve, disapprove, or partially approve in some cases too. But it's also important to note that in addition to that process about the analysis, Congress can choose to appropriate money for disasters at any time, and we don't have to go through this. NMFS does not have to go through this analysis. So as part of my research, I conducted an analysis of all appropriations and allocations, and at least $1.4 billion has been allocated since 1989. 16% of that was last year alone, and that doesn't even include these most recent supplementals that have just come in 2019 in the last couple of months. And half of that funding was for non-catastrophic disasters. So there weren't just hurricanes, there are these other types of disasters, which sometimes I call quiet disasters because they're not quite as obvious as those other ones. So we should hope that the funding would be helping to prevent future disasters. So I wanted to analyze these and see what kind of information I could mine out in terms of trends. So Were there differences by region, by state, by tribe versus non-tribe? What are tribes in the United States? These are tribes in the United States that have fishing rights that are guaranteed by treaty. And those are known as tribal fisheries, and they're federally recognized tribes in the West. So how did I grab these data and where from? This was quite a laborious process. So NMFS maintains a website with all determinations. So that's my starting point. This was all publicly available information that I use. We have additional information in-house, but I only use publicly facing information. For each determination, you get things like the request letter, a determination letter, press releases, and so on. And these are typically here the kinds of things that I managed to mine out of the data. So who requested them, what region they were in, whether they were tribal, and so on, like I said. And I kind of categorized those two. So I got a list of variables from that. So just to recap, a fishery disaster is a commercial failure as a result of a resource decline. But in my study, a fishery-specific disaster is a non-catastrophic disaster where you're able to pinpoint a specific fishery. Because remember, if you're going to analyze fisheries and count how many fishery disasters that you've occurred, first of all, you have to say, well, what's a fishery? And then you have to, figure out how you're going to pull those data out. And if it's a catastrophic disaster where a hurricane occurs, again, you don't go and do that analysis per fishery. You're just saying the disaster hit and the wheelhouse is gone and so on. So I looked at fishery-specific disasters as well as catastrophic ones, but just fishery-specific first. The first step in analyzing those disasters was to derive what a fishery is from the data, because several are rolled up into one determination on that website. So in one determination, there could be multiple fisheries over multiple years. So I had to parse that out first. So the fishery has three components, really: who requested it, where it occurred, and what resource was impacted. So as we see here on this slide, California ocean troll coho salmon, which was one of the disasters on the website, is a fishery that is managed and can suffer a disaster. Likewise, Massachusetts, New England multi-species groundfish is a fishery. However, I'm using this example to illustrate that for fisheries that are managed as mixed stocks under NMFS's determinations categorizations, it's difficult to know which species of groundfish were impacted. So in that case, in my analysis, mixed stocks were just considered a fishery and a species, I guess. So that is what a fishery is. A disaster, in my definition, is a thing that happens to a fishery in a particular fishing year. So you just take that formula for what is a fishery and you add a fishery fishing year to it, what year the disaster occurred, and that's a disaster. So for example, West Coast salmon impacted two species, coho and chinook, in that determination. For one fishing year with 3 requesters actually generated 6 disasters. So on the website, it might say 1 determination, but there's actually 6 disasters that happened. The 6 entities in 1 year. So likewise, just to further illustrate this, if you had 2 fishing years with 3 requesters, that's going to generate 12 disasters. And so this is just an example of what a tribal request would look like. In this case, it's the Lummi Nation that's the requester. So now I have all those disasters specified and laid out in a giant database, and I can review the materials and find out what the NMFS material says are the causes of the disasters. This was a slightly different type of process, and so just an example, pretty straightforward. It involved the laborious process of starting with the first disaster and creating a column for each new cause I found in the materials. A 1 was placed in the column if a disaster cited one of those causes, and so on for all the disasters. So every time I would go through a disaster and find a new cause, I just put number 1 there. And so then I came up with a list of all the causes that were ever given for every disaster since 1989. And I looked at trends. So because the funds are not only used as compensation, but to prevent future disasters, we would expect to see a downward trend in each of these variables here on the screen that I analyzed. So I used the Mann-Kendall trend test, which gives you a way to take a time series and determine whether there's a general increase, a general decrease, so a trend in either direction, and if there is, whether that is statistically significant. And here's what I found. So we want to see a downward trend, indicating the funds are preventing future disasters, looking at all disasters over the time period from, again, 1989 to 2017, and applying the Mann-Kendall test. As is probably apparent by this graph, there's no significant upward or downward trend, and we would really hope to see a downward trend, so things aren't really improving. So if you look across the 5 regions, this is what you find, and this is quite striking. So the majority of disasters, 53%, are in the states, are in the Pacific coast, and then they're also in the states of California, Washington, and Oregon. So 64% of those were in Washington. And then the second most common, of course, as you can see, is the North Pacific, and the third was Southeast and the Caribbean. And the majority of those in the Caribbean were, of course, more hurricane related and catastrophic types. The other ones on the West Coast there were no hurricanes. It was all those quiet disasters. So, and this is the opposite direction of what we'd want to see. So if we look by species, we find these are often not one-off occurrences. You see here that some of these species have pretty much been having disasters the entire time. So 2 major categories of fishing, the stuff that goes on in the ocean and inshore. I started noticing the differences there. So what's the status of that? It looks like there was a shift in about 1998 from predominantly oceanic fisheries to inland fisheries having disasters. So just jumping ahead a bit, and this is probably obvious, but the inland disasters pretty much are synonymous with salmon, right? So those anadromous fish that actually use the ocean as part of their life cycle and then swim upstream in the freshwaters. And so there can be disasters on fisheries there too. So in terms of tribal versus non-tribal, we're seeing an increase, particularly in the last couple of years, of disasters affecting Native American communities. So none of the Columbia River tribes has requested a disaster. So they're not even represented here. So we know there must be disasters happening, and a lot of them in the Columbia River tribes, but they're not even in these data. So during interviews, they expressed a number of reasons for that, including that they don't really have the data collection and record keeping that's needed really to submit a request. But really, actually, when I drilled down, the biggest reason they gave was that they felt that if they requested a disaster, that would say that their restoration had failed. And this was a concession that they just weren't willing to make. And so this is not a true assumption, of course, but in my view, this speaks to the tribal people's deep sense of responsibility and stewardship for salmon. And the information shared during the interviews I conducted supports that very strongly. So within the tribes, the state of Washington is predominant, especially those tribes fishing around the Puget Sound and on the coast, which makes sense. The breakout by species shows that 73% of all fishery-specific disasters nationwide are happening to the 5 species of Pacific salmon. So salmon have always been present year after year. All this black is salmon every single year except 1996. So an evolutionary significant unit, or ESU, is sometimes referred to as a stock or a run of salmon, and essentially each stock usually returns to the specific river or tributary where it was born in order to lay its eggs and to spawn. So it's one thing to talk about salmon at this kind of species level, which is where I started, but then any salmon biologist immediately started saying, well, you know, what about ESUs? And so I basically had to start breaking it down by ESUs. And as this table shows, there's a lot of variation within species as to the specific location of that run. So it's not the overall species, it's what particular run or ESU is affected. So here I mainly want to point out that the ESA listed stocks and the species of concern or special concern, those are all different categorizations, those are already in trouble, and now they're having disasters and in greater and greater numbers. And it turns out statistically significant increases in numbers. So when have these disasters by ESU occurred? Basically pretty recently. So you can see that a lot of ESUs have suddenly become a problem. Note the right-hand column highlighting the ESUs having disasters between that time frame of 2015 and 17. Basically that window of time when I first started handling disasters. So I think I wasn't losing it. I was actually seeing something that was unprecedented. So I looked at the trend for tribal fisheries and I found a statistically significant upward trend. So what you can see here is particularly for those fishing along the Puget Sound on Coho, a failure in that ESU affects many tribes. So this particular layout was just to illustrate whenever there's a failure on an ESU or on a species, you know, multiple tribes are impacted. So I derived 28 different causes, mining the materials from the website. El Nino and high ocean temperatures were the greatest. Other climate-related causes were also frequently mentioned. And while predation was only 10%, it is relatively recently reported. So we should kind of watch that to see if there's a trend that develops for that. And the tribes mentioned predation a lot.
Sea lion predation?
Yes.
Thank you.
You're going to see that, I know. These are the perceptions from the tribes. So there's a lot of information on this slide, but some key takeaways are these. I know it's a busy slide, so I'm going to point out a few things to look at. If you look at 2017, the 8 causes cited had all previously appeared, suggesting that conditions causing the disasters have persisted. In the last 10 years, from 2008, of the 10 causes newly appearing, only unfavorable ocean conditions, predation, and the blob, that warm water that persisted on the West Coast and Alaska, were in the top 10% of all disasters. There aren't enough data yet to assess whether these new causes may persist into the future. However, climate data may be able to help bring more certainty around that question. The climate data that NOAA has can help make predictions, and that's something that I'm looking at. Hurricanes are numerous and persistent, and that I just want to point out that excess fishing was last reported in the mid-1990s, and it was only on the East Coast where it was reported, and we've made policy changes since then and no longer accept excess fishing as part of a request. And lastly, high ocean temperatures are also numerous and persistent. So urban development is reported, but you'd expect to see more, but the tribes mentioned it a lot. A significant increase in inland salmon disasters was observed, and as you see, disease, high ocean temperatures, and El Nino were present about half the time. Predation, poor freshwater quality, and the blob were not as predominant. However, they're also new. So in the next phase of my research, I plan to combine some of these reported causes, which seem related, if not interchangeable, and then see if there's any trends there. So salmon have endured major impacts from habitat destruction and climate change. Looking down each column, the most frequently cited disasters for each species are highlighted here on this slide in green. So apart from disease in sockeye, you can see all the species have El Nino, drought, and high ocean temperature as their top causes. But climate and land use were factors in causing disasters for all of the salmon species. So climate and land use. This was just me rolling up into higher categories so that I could look at sort of like inland versus ocean. So by species of salmon and splitting out the ocean portion of the life cycle, temperature and climate play the biggest role in disasters consistently across all the species. Splitting out by the inland rivers portion of the life cycle, temperature and climate remain big, but disease and predation are bigger. So disease can be explained by all those sockeye disasters in the Fraser River runs, but predation is, again, kind of a curious find. So the next phase of my research will parse these categories out more cleanly. Collaborating with NOAA's atmospheric scientists can help with that. We've heard about the policy, appropriations, trends, and causes, but for this next phase of the presentation, I want to talk about some of those up close and personal impacts to the tribal communities. This really could be a second presentation, so I probably will do that in greater detail later, but I'm just going to try to run through some highlights. So what we've seen: Pacific Coast salmon, Native American communities, both disasters significantly increasing. What do those communities think about that? So I'm going to again highlight some of this information here. So what I did was I asked the tribal members how they thought about the Pacific salmon declines, how that has impacted them, and what they thought the situation was that was going on with salmon. So basically I took a mixed methods approach where I decided that I would basically play to the oral tradition of those societies involved, and I felt like just taking a story-based approach with them would make the most sense and would be the most respectful and appropriate way to gain understanding of the impacts. And this proved to actually be a very fruitful approach for both, for everyone involved. So again, I had sort of a survey tool that asked very simple demographic information. You know, are you male, female? You know, what kind of fisheries do you normally fish, if they fish? Some people weren't even fishermen. Survey just went out to tribes, tribal members. So I asked them, you know, kind of what their role was related to salmon, and collected a lot of demographic and background information. And then there was this qualitative tool where I just basically had an informal survey where I asked questions. So these are the 3 people I spoke with in Northern California, and they're from the Yurok tribe and live at the mouth of the Klamath River. The Klamath River tribes, the Yurok and the Hoopa, and some other tribes cooperate but are not part of a defined fish commission. These are the commissions, 2 of the commissions that basically unify some of the Pacific Coast tribal fisheries. So on the left, we have the Northwest Indian Fish Commission. You're looking at Puget Sound and the Olympic Peninsula in Washington there on the slide. And on the right, we have CRITFIC, or the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, which is much broader in scope, as you can see. Geographically, it's much broader. And then I sampled the ones that are, you know, I talked to the people that are, you know, they're highlighted with the red squares. And I deliberately wanted to kind of get those different spatial areas represented, which is why you see them, you know, both sort of like at the mouth of the Puget Sound, some of them more further south, and others there that are, you know, kind of right on the ocean. So the Stillaguamish fish in the rivers and in the ocean. The Nisqually mainly fish in the rivers, but they all do ocean fishing as well. And the macaw fish in rivers and in the ocean and are also whalers. So this is the kind of stuff that I was focusing on, and I wanted to map all of this material and information back to the causes and the data that I had analyzed. But I was interested in the perceptions of the tribes and what personal and community impacts were there, what in their view, what should be done, and then what if they had any advice or feedback for researchers, managers, policymakers, and so on. And of course they did. And again, remember my approach for this anthropological study was mixed methods. So these were only the qualitative interview questions here, not the survey questions. So other information about fishing practices was collected through the survey, but I just simply had an informal discussion, and I had this list of questions, and I just went down them one by one, and I talked to tribal members for an hour or more in some cases, and we just addressed all these questions. What does salmon mean to you, basically? How important is it to you? How has it enriched the way you view yourself? How have you adapted, and what other kinds of impacts has the loss of salmon had on you? So this is just sort of the general questions that I had. I took a novel sort of approach that I adapted from Fuertes, and I conducted these interviews very informally, and they were video audio conferences or by telephone if the people did not have access to video conferencing. And so I recorded with informed consent. So all the material that I'm sharing here has been approved with their consent, of course. And I have 20+ hours of interviews in all, which I'm told by social scientists that that's a pretty incredible amount. I don't really have a gauge for that. I'm a biologist, so this was kind of my first experience doing these kind of more social science type interviews. So I had a social scientist from NOAA on my committee who helped inform some of that approach, and that was really helpful. So from the interviews, I distilled 5 causes and 10 themes from the perspectives of tribal members. One of the major things that came from all of those interviews was the influence of dams. These dams were obstacles to fish, creators of those warm lakes in the river, promoters of disease. They disrupted the natural flow cycle. And here you see the before and after photos of the lower Elwha Dam before and after it was removed. So the lower Elwha Klamath tribe rejoiced when the dam was taken down, and they said that their only regret was that their ancestors weren't there to actually rejoice with them. So I just included this because I think it's ironic. I don't know about you, but one dam is named supposedly to honor Chief Joseph, who's a hero to all tribal peoples for his resistance to encroachment on his tribal lands. So concern for habitat was a huge part of the responses, and as you see from this quote and then the before and after pictures, imagine how painful that is to see if you're a tribal member. Also imagine if you're a salmon. The straightened river, you might think that that makes things easier, but it doesn't, because if the river's straight, that means it's going to flow a lot faster, and salmon are trying to swim upstream. And I think you know probably how much of an arduous journey already that is. So, and there aren't as many passages either to enter from the sea. Do you see all those passageways that were in the natural landscape? And then in the altered version, there aren't as many places to enter. And again, salmon return to that same tributary. So historically, cleaning up of the log jams so that ships could get through moved sheltered pools that the salmon rely on when moving upriver. Again, here we see that kind of infamous picture, right? Predation was unanimously an issue, and the tribal members said that it was mainly from sea lions. Previously, when there was no management, millions of fish were scooped out of the river using fish wheels, nets, whatever they could get their hands on, basically. But according to the tribes, there is still overfishing in the ocean and by sports fishermen, and they say they compete with sports fishermen for those fish. So climate change is viewed as the worrying last straw, the thing that they're totally out of control of, because you can get rid of the dams. It's a lot of work, and as you know, that's been a huge effort. You can get rid of the dams, you can prevent overfishing, restore the habitat, but the worry about not having control of water flows, like drought and flooding because of the glaciers melting and so on, and those warming waters, that's what they're concerned about now. So there are climate refugees as a result of this. The Killiot people have requested their ancestral lands back so that they can relocate because they're in danger of sea level rise and flooding and other things. So after hours of interviews, I began to observe themes in their stories that I was hearing. These are concepts or occurrences that kept repeating that I would hear. So I started terming them, and you know, as you know, tribal culture involves of storytelling and their worldview is that everything is interconnected. So I've just tried to attempt to put some order to some of the themes that I heard, but really all these things are interconnected. And that's because of the beauty of tribal culture, really. But I tried to pull some of these out. I heard a lot of humility as foundations for conservation stewardship. I heard that there's a lot of resilience and optimism in these people that's really rooted in an ethic of integrity and not giving up. I heard an application of their worldview to the role of management and hatcheries. They have stories, legends, and legacies that kind of cross-thread through all this. Family, community, cultural identity is huge, and spirituality and how salmon is connected to that. So humility as the foundation for conservation stewardship. This is the common theme that lots of people said, and it's probably expressed best, I guess, in this one quote. So I'm one piece of this world, but every piece that's around me is important to my world. So in practical terms, hatcheries are a necessary evil. They're without a question sustaining many populations of salmon. Some of the runs of salmon, just simply put, would probably not be, I'm not a salmon expert, but from what I've learned, those runs wouldn't even exist without the hatcheries. And I actually heard the tribal members say that too. So the tribes take more of a natural view, though, to their hatcheries management. And this is what one fishery manager told me from one of the tribes. We have rocks in the bottom, and they have natural hiding places under branches and stuff, so that when the osprey come and swoop down, they know to go hide from osprey in a safe place. So when they're being reared up in the hatchery and then later released out to the wild, they have some natural sense of how to behave in the environment. So as expressed through traditional stories, there was a genuine reverence for salmon, and not just as an economic or food source, it was almost like they were saying a prayer when they talked about salmon to me. So when the salmon are hurting, they're hurting. Given the special place that the legend of Yobuch, which is what the Stillaguamish tribe calls Chinook, has for that tribe, and their cultural heritage, I asked the tribal chairman how he felt about the fact that Chinook or Yobuch were in so much trouble, kept alive mainly, if not only, by hatcheries. And this is what he told me, basically that he's so grateful, again, like a prayer, so grateful to what salmon have given them, and that they basically wouldn't exist without salmon. So this is a good quote which expresses that theme about what people said about stories, listening to people, connecting, passing stories from generation to generation. So I'm obviously picking representative example quotes here. I have 20 hours of material, but this is the general tenor of what people told me across all the tribes. So they emphasize the fact that they are an oral people, that these traditions are passed down through their history, and that storytelling, when we talk about stories, we're not talking about legends, by the way. That's not what we're talking about. I mean, yeah, that's part of stories, but they're just talking about the way we talk to one another is a story, which is why when I reached out to them, I said, I'd like to give you the opportunity to tell your story. And that's why they were so forthcoming and wanting to talk to me, because these are their stories. And they talk about how important that is. So this is an example of practically living your culture. If nobody fishes for salmon and we're salmon people, then who are we? If you don't fish for salmon, how will you understand the stories, they said. So if I had time, I would play you a story of Eric Holt, one of the Nez Perce fishery managers. When he was 7 years old, and he was taken to this place, the Big Hole, and the Blue Hole on the Imnaha River in northeast Oregon, and he said it was the most beautiful place he'd ever seen, and that you can just hear how important this is to his culture, and how hooked he got when he caught his first salmon there with his family when he was 7. And we have time in the end. I'd like to play you that 3.5-minute video, but we'll see how questions and everything go. But so So again, a much expressed sentiment about how important it is to live your culture. Otherwise, it is no different than a gym membership. So this is again the material I got, the story I got from one of the tribal leaders. If we lose our culture, we lose our identity. We just become a tribe on a piece of paper. We just become an economic tribe. What people say, you know, a casino tribe. You know, don't want to just be like a gym membership. So then he kind of sarcastically said, I'm a card-carrying member of the Stillaguamish tribe. That doesn't mean anything at all. So it's just important to note this depth of this impact. This theme was about the circle of life and the recognition about where they fit in the circle, not to disrespect the salmon for what they give to the circle, to be grateful. And if there aren't enough, don't eat them. They say, we love you enough to let you pass. So even though they're given a quota, they sometimes just choose not to use that quota. When asked a question, it wasn't long before they connected the answer to another topic, always staying within the bounds of our set of topics and questions, but they all bled together. This feeling of oneness with salmon, their brothers, their family. So you take the gift, but you give in return and make sure that you continue that legacy. And that's expressed here, you know, in this quote about spirituality and giving back. And here's another thing that represents that theme is when they said, when we first bubbled out of our sacred spring on Mount Shasta at the time of creation, we were helpless and unable to speak. It was Salmon, the Niño, who took pity on us humans and gave us their voice. And in return, we promised to always speak for them. So it's a stewardship responsibility that they take extremely seriously. Now, on to the next group of themes. They were persecution, bureaucracy, treaties, and health. These are the kind of things recurring things I kept hearing. It was hard to listen to all the stories about sports fishermen and local people cutting their nets, calling them names, throwing things at them now, like today, this is happening. People thinking about them as what they said, their perceptions that other people had of them as being unregulated, privileged, because they have the right to 50% of their quota and just take what they want. They view them as primitive people who just go out and take all the fish, when in fact, they're the most reverent, sensible, forward-thinking managers that I have come to know. Some of these incidents that are reported here on this slide were shared with me during my interviews just last fall. So this persecution is not just something, you know, from the salmon wars long ago, but is still happening now. So the salmon wars of the 1970s had a huge impact, though, on those involved and were often cited as almost breaking points in the tribal psyche. So Diane here talked about losing an entire generation in my interview with her. So this is the vivid account from 40 years ago. Diane has been interviewed multiple times about her story of the salmon wars, but this is part of what she recounted to me. What stood out of this, though, about this memory was how she felt she would die without anyone ever knowing the true story. Again, the story is so important. You've got to get that story right. And she said, they're going to screw up my story of what happened to me and my family and friends because the white men were in control of her story. So this seems to have left a really deep scar on her psyche. You might know, have heard of the famous Billy Frank Jr., who died in 2014. He was a leader of the Nisqually tribe in Washington State, and he was an activist for treaty rights and so on. And he, again, pushed for having enough salmon to be left for, future generations. So these quotes were from various people I spoke with about their treaty rights. But again, the important is that these treaty rights give you the power not to fish, that 50% of what you're quoted. And also those measures also ensure that there are fish for future generations too. So this is where things were really important to them. If the salmon are sick, we're sick. That was what I heard again and again. There's a rise in diabetes, obesity, and so on across what they called Indian country. So again, just in summary, tribes and salmon have coexisted for at least 10,000 years in that area, but the white settlers arrived only a blip in time, 150 years ago. And since then, that's when the salmon decline started happening. They felt they had everything that they needed. Tribes had survived proudly, sustainably, and independently for a long time, thousands of years before that. And here we are today. Fishery disasters for Native American tribes and inland salmon populations are increasing. We see trends in nationwide disasters increasing, are increasing, not increasing or decreasing, which is not good because we'd want them to decrease. Disaster assistance should help prevent future disasters, so we would really like to see more of that. So conservation management is complicated on the Pacific coast with state quotas involved as well. But just wanted to point out a few things. Pacific coast has a complicated climate as well as human dimension. Again, there's co-management that's going on. Number of closures is increasing. But the tribes are still not giving up. So salmon is the identity of the native peoples across the Pacific Northwest and Northern California, and you can see that here in all of their tribal symbols. They either have a salmon or a river or something like that, symbolizing who they are. So quickly, I'm going to give a few recommendations. Tribal people are frustrated about being misunderstood. So they basically want to see that we're paying attention to their story and respecting what they bring to the table in these discussions. And as Sean Yanity said, he really wants to see that people listen and exercise that practice of listening the way they do as part of their culture. So they're doing statistically, scientifically based management, and they employ trained and educated scientists, managers, leaders, and lawyers. So why don't we ask them for help? And that's what they said. They said, sometimes, at best we get, a call for providing input, but why aren't you, coming to us and saying, why don't you, we can teach you, can you teach us how to do this? And so they were calling for that as well. So a lot of money has been spent on salmon disasters alone, so let's invest in understanding the causes. There's a lot to be said about transparency, easy access, sharing information, and so on. So only a snapshot of my recommendations are, number one, improve the transparency, clarity, and detail reported for disasters on that public website. Mining that data out in a rolled up kind of way was difficult, and hopefully not people beyond me, researchers could use those data, but not in the current form that it's in. And so open this data set to scrutiny and further studies by researchers that are knowledgeable in these fields. Consider revising the NMFS policy to address the problem that occurs, like I said, when a fishery hasn't been able to fish or just chooses not to fish, like the tribes often do, within the previous 5 years, and thereby disqualifying them for requesting assistance. So much to be done, but again, here are just a few highlights from my dissertation. I want to look more at those overlaps of information about what we've seen actually reported that I just analyzed. What are the climate data for that? I'd like to do a story map that actually provides a lot of the video material so people can hear the tribes themselves in their own words. And so more studies looking at impacts on communities and quantify some of the results of the tribal study.
Were those lamprey, the upper photo, previous photo,
yeah.
Tribes harvest lamprey?
Oh, sorry.
and prey they're harvesting, just one.
You know, I don't know.
It looks like.
But it looks like that kind of condition would be, yeah. Then, and on what's on the ice there, it definitely looks like. So just, you know, ask whether these are indeed disasters or whether they can indicate trends, you know, toward a set of complex ecological or management problems. You know, what exactly is going on, and you know, FEMA can actually help. You know, collaborate with us on data collection when they go out there on a hurricane, for instance, and collect all that data. You know, maybe we can kind of team up with them. So, two things I'm looking at just right now to close is just examining whether extreme weather events are causing the disasters in collaboration with a scientist on the from the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, Nate Manchua, and then another publication looking at that anthropological piece with Carmen Norman, an anthropologist also in the Northwest Fisheries Science Center. So these are a symptom of what really is a much greater set of problems, which is what spurred me to do this to begin with. The social impacts to communities cannot be overstated, and the MSA requires NOAA Fisheries to assess those social impacts of disasters. So this research is also the first of its kind. There's nothing in the peer-reviewed or elsewhere literature on fishery disasters. So really this humongous overview is just laying that foundation and groundwork for others then, you know, to do further research. So acknowledging my committee, those tribal organizations that were so forthcoming, as well as the individual tribal members with their stories. And then there were some of my colleagues who I need to thank for, you know, providing peer review of my dissertation research as well. And lastly, I'll end with this acknowledgement of my family because I wouldn't have been able to do it without them. My husband, who's here in the room today, Frank McLean, actually was my data manager. This is a team effort. Was my data manager and really helped you know, stand up a lot of that graphical material. And my daughter there in the center is a videographer, budding scientist, but passionate videographer, helped me a lot with that material. And my little girl was then 8 years old, vegetarian, but prepared a lot of dinners for us, you know, mainly salad spreads. So anyway, just wanted to thank them too. And that's it. Thank you.
We're kind of short on time. I'm gonna ask if there's any questions in the room first.
I know it's a lot of material.
I do have a question.
Yes.
And, I think most of your work is to separate the overfishing from other type of causes.
Mm-hmm.
And in your research, how you have done that?
Well,
that's the only problem we face all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how to separate overfishing? I mean, something that is coming from fishery,
mm-hmm.
something coming from climate change,
so
or something else. I mean, but sorry that I
mm-hmm.
one more argument is when you showed them the other side of the social side, you showed that the dam was the cause. It's not climate, but now it's another cause of salmon for the salmon case.
That's right. So the question is basically, how did I separate overfishing from all the other types of causes, and also just noting the impact of the dam, and then how in combination with that, there are huge, you know, climate is also adding impact. So actually it was quite easy because as part of the policy, overfishing cannot be a cause for part of the application for disaster assistance. So I didn't have to separate that out. It really wasn't even allowed. However, in the materials for the request, I did actually find, like I said, in New England earlier on, they actually put in the request, they actually said it was due to overfishing, and we actually funded that back then, but a long time ago. And so, yeah, so basically, we don't do that anymore. We don't have positive determinations anymore, give money, you know, for overfishing as a cause. So it was easy to sort it out because it just wasn't, it's not an allowable cause. Yes?
Sort of along those lines, but in their requests, are they directed to select some of the variables used as the causes, or did you pull them out from the one paragraph?
So she's asking, did I get the causes from the letters, the
Yeah.
paragraph form?
Was it something that you categorized based on the descriptions? Or
Oh, I
was it
see.
directed to a list of possible causes?
Yeah, so how did I come up with the causes, basically, and how did I characterize those? And I just used exactly the words that they gave me. So I was paragraph form. I had to go through every letter and every material, press release, anything that was in the data, and actually look at any causes that were identified. And every time there was a new cause, then I added that to my list of causes. And I didn't create any of those causes.
I'm going to clarify her question.
Okay.
Do the tribes or anyone who's submitting a request, do they have a list to choose from?
A pick list.
They don't have a pick list, but they do not have a pick list to choose from, as they also don't have a pick list to choose from of what they're asking for restorate, or like how. And so that's something that I think that the agency is going to be looking at is like in FEMA, for instance, if you apply for assistance, not only do you have to identify what the cause was and what your impacts were, you also have to say upfront in the request what you're asking the funds to be spent on. And we don't do that either. We don't ask them what they're going to spend the money on. We do that later at the spend plan phase, but we don't front load it. It's something that we're looking at.
I'm going to grab a few questions online. Disease pathogen were pretty consistently high ranked, causes of disaster. Did they specify what diseases or pathogens?
They did. And I cannot remember what those were. They did. Frank, do you remember? Because he's the data manager. What's that? He said if I want a graph, he'll give me one, because he was my graph generator. I'm sorry. But I do have it in my data, so I will get back to you on that, I promise. Sorry about that.
Second question, was Deepwater Horizon an authorized fishery disaster?
Yes.
And where could they read about that? Find that information?
I can forward the information on where you can read about that disaster request. But it was an authorized disaster. It got a lot of funding.
There was a question about El Niño. Which factors would you say are linked to El Niño? The listener noticed that factors like warming water, the blob, that they might be connected.
They are, and Nate has very kindly offered his expertise to me on that. So Nate Mantua, the atmospheric scientist on the West Coast that I'm collaborating with, is helping me actually combine some of those causes that like the way that an atmospheric scientist would look at them. Again, I just wrote down these are the causes that were reported, and I didn't want to change or affect any of that. He's helping me go, well, some of these are synonymous, and so we will roll those up and categorize them at a higher level. So yeah, that's a very good point, and that's something I want to work on next. Yes, Steve?
A quick question. Are any of these related to closures related to shellfish poisoning, like paralytic shellfish poisoning, where you have shellfish that are harvested that then cannot be harvested and sold because of basically contaminated by biological contaminants?
Yep. Yeah, we've had that. We've had, just because of the closures, because of the emergency health measures that we take, those are also disasters. Again, as long as they meet that revenue loss, as long as they meet those criteria and they're a commercial fishery, state or federal, actually, by the way, they can put in a request and get approval from the Secretary for funding. Mm-hmm.
I just was interested in the fact that her data is falsified by what was reported. And is that true or not true? We don't know. I mean, just say climate is one of the causes.
That's right.
We know that's hard to, at least to get. It's not an easy thing.
So he's saying that the causes were just reported by others, and we have to take those at face value, basically, rather than being able to confirm that they are indeed the cause. And that is something that I address, in my discussion, in my dissertation. but I have a pretty high level of confidence that those actually match what actually happened and that they're accurate. So the requester actually has to be a state or a tribal leader, and those requests come from the state's fish and wildlife departments, or if it's a tribe, their fish and wildlife department. And so sometimes the request is actually submitted by the natural resource manager, and they've actually documented that. And when we look at the request, we do review that resource decline part and confirm whether or not there is indeed an allowable cause that makes sense. So that actually is analyzed. We don't just completely just take it, you know, at face value. And there's a lot of back and forth actually that goes on between the, you know, maybe the headquarters and the region, and then asking the region to go back to the requesters and get clarification. And sometimes we do change, you know, what that is. So.
Do you want to go one more question?
Yeah. Yeah, we're at time. Okay.
Looking at your data, you have seen anything in recent years that is increasing because of climate-related disasters? Is it increasing or the same thing with before? How many years of your data first? Sorry.
I'm sorry. Are you asking me what the data set is for?
Because we do know that the Niño events and all this are becoming, you know, more and more than used to be before. But I don't know how long the time series is. So
it's from 1989 to 2017. Yep. That was at the time of the dissertation. That was the entire course of history of fishery disaster determinations.
Okay. Yeah, we're over time, but thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Yes, I'm happy.
Coming.
I'm happy to answer questions later. Thanks.